Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another day of Bible study. We're taking a look at chapter 34 in the book of Job today. You can download our PDF on our website at tobelikechrist.com if you would like. We remain in the second section of the book. We've got about 3 chapters left of the dialogue between Job and his friends. They've got lots of questions. God is going to have some questions specifically for Job coming up in chapter 38. So they all want answers. Well, God's going to demand some answers and I guess kind of put them, humble them a little bit. We'll just say that. Let me not get ahead of myself, though. As far as our main characters, we have Job, but really the main character in this chapter is Elihu. Elihu had been listening to the conversation between Job and Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad for quite a while, and in chapter 32 through 37, he shares his thoughts and opinions on the matter. So 32 through 37, these 5 chapters or so, they're all Elihu speaking. He was the youngest of the group, as we've mentioned before, and that's why he spoke last. Now, if you remember in the last chapter, Elihu really kind of launched into his opinions, and he was very, very critical of Job, using a little bit more developed argument, but pretty much the same as what Job's friends had proposed. He said that God was speaking to Job, God was giving Job answers, he was giving him answers through discipline, basically telling Job, hey, the answer is you've done something wrong, and that's why you're being disciplined. And Elihu was saying, well, Job's just too stubborn to listen to God's answer. So now he's going to continue to build on this, and he begins this chapter in kind of a harsh way. We've got 37 verses to cover today. I have broken it down into 2 sections. The first one is verses 1 through 9. Elihu mischaracterizes Job. Elihu said that he had tasted Job's words and found them an offense to his palate, like he'd eaten something disgusting. He declared that Job was a scoffer and a man who kept company with evildoers in verse 8. And then he really badly misrepresents Job. And I think anyone who's read the rest of the book and read Job and read his words is going to realize that this is a mischaracterization. He says this, quote, "For he, Job, has said, it profits a man nothing that he should take delight in God." So this was hardly a fair representation. Basically what he's saying here is, since Job is saying, oh, I'm righteous and yet I'm being punished anyway, Elihu's saying, well, what Job's actually saying is that it doesn't matter whether you live a righteous life or the life of a sinner, God's going to treat you the same way anyway. And that really is not what Job has been proposing. He hasn't been advocating a life of sin so that you can end up with the same destiny as a righteous person. It's a mischaracterization. This now brings us to section number 2, verses 10 through 37. Elihu positions himself as the defender of God's righteousness. So according to Elihu, Job was accusing God of wickedness, and Elihu kind of puts himself forth as the virtuous one, as the one who's the defender of God's righteousness. He said, of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. He repeated then this oversimplified view of God that had been previously championed by Job's friends, this idea that God repays men according to their actions and their fates are always based on their works. In verse 13 through 15, Elihu re-emphasized God's awesome power and authority over nature. That's something that had already been established and mutually agreed upon several times in the previous conversation. He spoke about God's impartiality and his fair distribution of justice, and then he repeated once again the established fact that God knows everything and nothing is hidden from him. According to Elihu, instead of arrogantly resisting guilt, Job should have embraced God's discipline as a sign of his guilt, and rather than contending for his own righteousness, what Job should have done was ask God to teach him what his error was, because clearly he was unaware of it. Elihu concludes this chapter with a string of accusations. He told Job that he spoke without knowledge, he answered like a wicked man, and he was guilty of multiplying words of rebellion against God. So once again, a pretty harsh chapter condemning Job. Job's not getting any slack from Elihu. Maybe he thought he might after his 3 friends spoke, but they haven't let up on him. Just notice, though, that Elihu, he said that he was going to present something new and enlighten everyone to the true nature of the situation. But here in this chapter, again, he kind of just repeats stuff that's already been agreed upon or already been stated in the conversation in the first 30 chapters of this discussion. So we'll see what else he has to offer tomorrow. Okay, so now for our application. This comes from Elihu's claims of possessing all this wisdom. Be cautious about people who introduce themselves as the possessors of wisdom. Wisdom should be judged by words and actions, not by claims and credentials. Elihu prefaced all of his words with this promise that he was going to enlighten the group with wisdom. And so far, we really haven't seen him present hardly anything new or of value keeping that promise. He actually says some provably wrong things in these last few chapters. Just because a person presents themselves as wise doesn't mean that they're wise. It doesn't mean that they actually know anything or have anything of value to share. And this happens all the time in our world. I think I see it most often on social media, a lot of times on YouTube even. I see this happen when someone leads into a conversation or a debate by stating their credentials, their education, or their life experiences. Some Bible teachers do this. They want you to believe them just because they went to seminary. Some people want you to unquestionably accept their presentation of science just because they have a PhD in a particular field. Some people think that having a bunch of subscribers on YouTube makes them credible. Debatable. When someone leads with their credentials and the expectation that you should accept whatever they say as beyond scrutiny because they are, quote, the experts, here's my advice to you. Immediately begin scrutinizing what that person has to say. That's an immediate red flag. Claims of wisdom stand or fall on the validity of the ideas presented, not on the credentials of the speaker. I've heard some PhDs say some verifiably wrong things. I've heard some Bible scholars butcher the biblical text, and I've heard so-called wise men try to present the behavior of God from an elementary perspective. That's what we're seeing here in Elihu and in Job's friends, and that is still happening today. So don't take someone's word for it just because they quote a bunch of credentials in your face as they lead off the conversation, especially with religious matters. That's why being in our Bibles and holding these people to account with the actual biblical text is so important. That's our study in Job chapter 34, and Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to hear a little bit more from Elihu in chapter 35, see if he's still got that wisdom tucked up his sleeve.